All right, so just to finish up here, a couple of things. And this is probably stuff I would guess maybe you learned back in elementary school. So if we think about the structures, okay, of a plant, we have petals, we have leaves, stems, roots, flowers, and they each have a different job to do. Petals typically attract pollinators. The stem supports the plant. The function of leaves is to carry out photosynthesis to make sugar, make glucose. The roots anchor the plant. Okay, so just connect them the right way. And flowers are the reproductive structures. Flowers are for reproduction. What does yours say?
Okay, we have one that says makes leaves, and then we have makes seeds.
You can figure it out, right?
Yeah.
Makes water the leaves, roots are the stem, both. The roots absorb water, the stem transfers it. So if we look at a cross-section of a plant, so this is for what we call woody plants, okay, versus the other type of plant is an herbaceous plant. If you think about grass is herbaceous, it's just all green, okay, doesn't have a thick persistent stem. Woody plants do, they have some wood. So we think about a woody plant. The outermost layer is the bark, obviously. The inner layer of the bark is actually living. The outer layer is not. That inner layer is the phloem. Okay, and then the xylem is the next layer in. It helps to bring material from the roots up to the leaves and the other parts of the plant. And then at the sort of center part of the wood, okay, is something called the heartwood. Okay? And the heartwood is basically the xylem and phloem that's no longer functioning. Okay? So it's sort of done its job. Okay? It's one of the hardest parts of the wood of a tree, gives it strength. It's good for woodworking. It's dry. It's very strong. And so you see that. You see the outer bark, okay, then the phloem, the growing layers called the cambium, and the xylem, and then in the middle is that heartwood. So it's the outermost areas. So have you ever heard of if you like carve a ring around a tree? It's called girdling a tree. If you carve a ring around it deep enough, the tree will die. Because basically you're interrupting all of the flow of material up and down if you destroy these outermost layers. You don't have to cut all the way through the tree. And trees grow different amounts depending on the season. Okay? And that results in the growth of tree rings. Tree rings are formed, you probably know this, you could look at a cross-section from the trunk of a tree and tell how old the tree is based on that. And yeah, I have one up here, a big trunk, and that tree is over 100 years old. And that's because in the summer, in the growing season, more wood is put on. And then in the winter or the dry season, depending on where you are, less growth happens. And so because you have more and less, it forms these layers of summer and winter growth that you could actually count. Okay, and those rings allow you to count how old the tree is. So for example, this tree is 5 years old. It has 5 rings, and this one's 10 years old. You could also not only tell how old it is, but what conditions were like at that time. So if you have a year with a very thick ring, probably means it was warm, there's plenty of moisture, and so forth. So you can tell a little bit about what conditions were like in the past by looking at those tree rings. And here you see some other examples of some of those. And some trunks, it's very distinct and you can easily count them. And others, it takes a little bit more work. Don't they what?
Like the trees, when they grow, they're covered in
Yeah, you can tell by thickness sort of which sides are growing more or less. So this has to do with what we talked about, deciduous trees. They lose their leaves. They're usually flat. They change colors in the autumn if they're in an area where they lose their leaves. What we call evergreen trees maybe are conifers. They generally have needle-like leaves, very thin. They don't generally drop them all at one time. They do lose them. Okay? They reproduce differently, so they're not flowering plants. They have cones, pine cones, for example. Pine cones, there's male and female versions. They have pollen, pollinates. Female cones, they develop seeds, and so forth. If you have conifers around your house, you probably notice that the cones, they drop their cones. Okay.
I have a wine.
So they drop their cones certain times to help their seeds disperse. They also produce, usually, they're wind pollinated. Okay, so the cones, there's different types of cones. You probably noticed the female cones that contain the seeds. They're the ones that drop onto your lawn, and your parents may go pick them up probably. The male cones are smaller. They're where the pollen produced. They look different. They typically stay in the branches there and don't fall out.
Like last week or so that wait, more.
Did I tell you that?
Yeah.
No, not necessarily. You guys know your trees at all?
I know birch and maple and everything.